My pleasure to introduce Molly, and as you can see, she's going to be visiting with us today virtually. Molly, can you say hello?
Hi, everybody.
Everybody hear Molly fine? Yep. All right.
Yep, great.
Well, Molly is the Director of Climate Change Adaptation for the Americas program for the Wildlife Conservation Society, and her work focuses on this idea of linking the science experts with the people on the ground to generate something that happens that is good for the resource. For the past 10 years, she's been helping lead climate change planning efforts involving lots of different stakeholders across North America. It was one of her presentations about that effort that I heard that led me to believe that she would be the perfect person to come talk to us about this today. She has also co-edited the book Climate Conservation, Landscape and Seascape Science. So she is, as I had mentioned earlier, a big thinker and a very smart person. So, without further ado, I'll let Molly go ahead and give this presentation on linking vulnerability assessments and conservation actions. Molly, go right ahead.
Well, thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction. And I really am sorry that I cannot be there in person. I've had a chance to just see a little bit of some of the work you guys are going to be doing, or see the agenda and learn a little bit about the work you're going to be doing the rest of today and tomorrow. And I'm quite jealous because I can tell you're going to be having some very interesting, potentially some challenging conversations, but doing the really important work and the challenging work, but really important work of not just understanding what's happening in our landscapes and what the future might look like, but actually trying to get into what to do about it. I'm also sad not to be there because I had the great fortune of starting out my career in doing climate change conservation planning in the Four Corners region through a series of projects that I partnered with the Nature Conservancy on, and that involved a lot of different partners in the landscape. And so I hope that at some point in the future I have a good opportunity to come back to that landscape again and get to meet you all in person going forward. But thank you very much to John and Kevin and Megan and the other workshop organizers for asking me to present today. I hope that some of these bigger picture comments and some of the examples that I share will be good, useful food for thought, maybe provide some inspiration in thinking about the work you'll be doing over the next 2 days, but also thinking about how you might continue to interact together as a collaboration going forward. And so through my presentation, I wanted to cover 3 main topics. The first is just some overarching comments about planning for future changes and some of the kinds of tools that are out there, and just be reiterating some of the importance of doing so. And then I'll talk a little bit more specifically, as John mentioned, about some of examples of how we go beyond thinking about vulnerability assessments to using those assessments to help us think about management and conservation goals and actions. And I'll do that through an example of a project that I've been working on in collaboration with partners here in the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative region. And then hopefully there'll be time at the end. I'll share a couple of examples of conservation practitioners out on the ground implementing projects that are designed to help wildlife and ecosystems prepare for, respond to, and cope with the effects of climate change. So that hopefully, again, as your conversations start to shift towards thinking about actions on the ground and what kinds of priorities you might have as individuals or individual agencies, or as the collaborative group that you have assembled there, you may provide some interesting ideas for thinking about strategies that could be relevant in your landscape. So in terms of starting off by thinking about how we plan for future changes, as I mentioned in my work, I'm really primarily focused on climate change. I know that you are assembled to talk about issues beyond just changes in climate that may be already observed on your landscape or projected for the future, but also thinking about other kinds of landscape changes, that some of which may again be exacerbated by climate change, and others that may be driven more by human changes in the human footprint of the landscape. And so a lot of my work has helped people think about increasing severity and frequency of flooding events and wildfires, thinking about changes in high elevation snowpack and the timing at which snow is melting out, changes that we have already been observing in a lot of landscapes across the West. But also thinking about those climate and environmental changes in the context of, again, a changing human footprint and how land use is changing and the decisions that we're making about land use is changing across the landscape as well. And so while my work has primarily focused on climate change, and most of the examples that I'm going to be sharing with you today are specifically focused on responding to the impacts of the changing climate, I think a lot of the concepts about how we plan for the future, how we link some vulnerability assessments to actions, and even some of the examples at the end of my presentation, I think will be very relevant for current day issues that you're facing in the landscape and other kinds of non-climate changes as well. So one of the challenges in my job is that there is, one of the good things, I mean, there's both a good and bad thing. There's a lot of information about how a changing climate can impact the species and landscapes that we all care about in our personal lives, but also are tasked with managing or conserving in our work lives. And I'm sure many of you have read scientific reports or agency reports or newspaper articles about changes in climate and what it might mean for things we care about. And, you know, a lot of that news is bad news. And that really concerns me, not because I think those reports are wrong or overplaying the concerns, because I am very, very concerned about climate change. But I'm also concerned that if everybody just gets really down and depressed when they think about climate change, that, you know, that's not a place from which we can be energetic and creative in coming up with strategies and solutions for dealing with difficult problems. And so a lot of my work has focused on making sure that we do look at what the impacts and vulnerabilities are and that we're currently facing in our landscape, but also likely to continue, you know, face maybe even more of in the future. And to try to help people move beyond that to getting at the questions of, so what are we going to do about it? How do we need to respond to those impacts? How can we better prepare for those impacts so that we as communities of people, but also the wildlife and the ecosystems that are in our landscape will be better prepared to respond to and cope with those climate change impacts. And so that's been a real critical part of me being able to just, I think, stay going into the office on a day-to-day basis, is that I really try to kind of work on that solution side of the equation. And so, you know, one of the challenges is in how do we kind of move ourselves to thinking about the strategies and actions that we can take and the interventions we can implement on the ground. Is that, you know, it is still really hard to go from all this scientific information on changes in climate or other kinds of changes in the landscape to asking questions about what specific actions can we take on the ground and where should we be taking those actions in order to be as successful as possible in light of future changes. So, you know, this is sort of the big challenge that we're here to talk about and to work through. You guys are there to work through together as a group. Now, fortunately, I think there is a lot of support for thinking about, okay, well, how do we break this problem down? How do we kind of go step by step through a planning effort that is explicitly thinking about changes in climate or other changes in the landscape. I've been involved in an effort to put together a framework called the Adaptation for Conservation Targets framework, or the ACT framework down in blue in the corner here. But I found that in talking with my other colleagues that do this kind of climate-informed planning, we've actually converged on a lot of really similar elements to this stepwise climate-informed conservation planning. So whether you're familiar with the Climate Smart Conservation Cycle, which was the product of a large collaboration that I was involved in as well, agencies and NGOs and state and feds, in putting together sort of our collective learning about the process of climate-informed conservation planning. Some of you may have been introduced to the National Park Service's work on future scenario planning. There are a lot of different approaches to how we go beyond just thinking about the impacts to thinking about the actions that we might take in response to those changes in climate and in the landscape. And they share a lot of similarities, and so if there's one message that I can share is that, you know, as you guys do talk about ways and tools and frameworks you might use for going forward during this workshop and beyond, I would emphasize that, you know, there's no necessarily like right or wrong way to begin to bring the assessment information into your management thinking. There are a lot of tools that are helpful and familiar, and they share a lot of familiarity with strategic habitat conservation planning, other kinds of conservation planning that many of you have probably been involved in over the years. So these are not necessarily totally foreign concepts for how to think about climate change, but there are some interesting nuances to how we bring that information into the kind of planning that many of us are familiar with. And so some of the kinds of similarities that we see across these planning processes is that they really encourage participatory and iterative approaches to generating very local and place-based, place-relevant adaptation or climate-informed conservation strategies. And I've highlighted those terms in red because I want to say a little bit more about each one of them in turn. So when we talk about them being participatory approaches, many of us are encouraging conversations that explicitly and directly engage both scientists and managers together in the conversation. So we create that two-way street of information exchange where hopefully the best available science is being brought into the discussion, but also the practical realities of how decisions get made are also in that conversation. So it's not just the science experts coming up with ideas on what to do. It's not necessarily the managers just drawing upon their direct information, but they're working together with available science. And you know, you guys will be embarking on this exact kind of two-way information exchange in this workshop that you're at this week, where Megan and her team will be sharing information on the assessments they've done, but it's also a chance for you to weigh in on that information and provide feedback and continue to shape your understanding of the current status of the system and what might happen in the future. They also, almost all of these approaches embrace this iterative process of we develop our plan, we implement it, but we're not done there. We actually need to go out and monitor and evaluate whether our plan is successful, whether our actions are successful, and if they're not, we need to make changes. And so again, very familiar to strategic habitat conservation planning, other kinds of conservation planning, embracing that iterative approach. And then when we talk about their design to develop place-based climate adaptation strategies, it's really just kind of a fancy way of saying what to do. What actions can we take to achieve our management goals in light of a changing climate? And, you know, wanting those strategies to be as place-specific, as specific to the species or ecosystems we're managing, and specific to the local context of the landscape or even sort of sub-watersheds within the landscape where we're working. Understanding the history of management of those places, socioeconomic context of those places. So trying to really be relevant to the places where we're making decisions. So just to kind of pull up the climate smart conservation cycle again, to illustrate how they're designed to include steps of vulnerability assessment, but also help people move beyond that vulnerability assessment. Because that information is a really critical part. It's often the starting point for most groups, is to say, let's do a climate change vulnerability assessment for the species or ecosystems where we work, that we work on. And that is a really important step, but I would also emphasize that it's not an endpoint in of itself. It's really a critical input into conversations about what our goals are and what they might need to look like in the face of the changes and the impacts and vulnerabilities that we've assessed. And to then get to saying what actions can we take to achieve those goals in the face of those impacts and vulnerabilities. And then again, of course, moving through that adaptive management cycle where we select which actions we're going to take those actions, and evaluate their effectiveness. So, you know, I think this is probably obvious to many of you, but just to reiterate that a discussion of vulnerabilities is a critical input to these conversations. And And in the case of, say, climate change planning or other kinds of future landscape changes, it's the piece that makes this conservation planning process different from if we weren't thinking about future changes to the landscape. It's where we look at the success of our goals and the potential success of our actions in the face of a future landscape, which may look different than it does today. So just to dig a little bit deeper into that process of applying vulnerability assessments to thinking about our management goals and actions, I would say that my experience in doing climate-informed conservation planning in the earlier years, and in some cases, we're sort of more on this exploratory thinking end of the spectrum. It's maybe the first time that we've thought about climate change as it relates to a particular species or ecosystem that we manage, and we just want to kind of step back and unpack for ourselves as an individual or as a group what climate change might mean and how it might affect our management choices. And so a lot of times those are not necessarily about making a decision on which exact actions to take in particular places, but it's more just putting ideas and brainstorming ideas for what kinds of actions we might consider. But then there are other efforts, and I would say in more recent years, my work has tended to shift more in the direction of how can we use vulnerability assessments to actually help support decision-making, making some of those tough choices about which actions to take and where to take them in the landscape. And of course, these are connected. Oftentimes we start with some exploratory thinking and we use it to feed ideas into decision-making. And so I don't have a lot of time to talk about some of the exploratory adaptation planning or climate-informed conservation planning that we've done, but oftentimes it's in a workshop setting. It sounds like you guys will be embarking on some similar kinds of discussions here at this workshop, where after talking about the vulnerability analyses, you're going to think a little bit about what kinds of strategies and priorities might be really important for the group to think about in the face of those changes and those impacts. And so a lot of times we bring together scientists and managers in these workshops, and we're talking about a particular species or a particular ecosystem, like you all are doing this week. And we try to just put lots of ideas out on the table. What possible actions might we take in terms of restoring habitat or restoring fish or whatever species we're focused on, in terms of policy changes we could make, in terms of how we manage private land or how we coordinate across the many players across the landscape. And we often come out of these workshops with what I like to call long menus of potential climate adaptation options. So again, we're not saying which individual actions we're going to take, but we're putting lots of ideas on the table, and oftentimes you can have many pages of ideas, long menus of options. But as we all know, we can't necessarily take every action on that list in every place where we work across the landscape. And so, it is necessary at some point to take this menu and try to drill down to which actions are most relevant in a particular part of the landscape, given the kinds of impacts that we expect there. So more recently, I've been involved in a project where we're trying to help move closer to specific decision-making of actions to take on the ground, where we can combine information on climate change vulnerability and use that information to select from among that menu of climate adaptation options to get at what actions we might take, where we should take them on the landscape, and being really explicit about the goals that we're trying to achieve when we take those actions. So the project that I'll describe briefly right now is one that was supported by the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative. It was implemented in partnership with managers and scientists that were part of what we call the Rocky Mountain Partner Forum. And it is maybe a little bit less of a tight geographic focus like your group is there in the Four Corners region, but it's sort of broadly working with a subset of Great Northern partners that are operating in the Rocky Mountain parts of the landscape. And we were trying to design a framework where we could use and apply that information on climate change vulnerabilities to help us select goals and actions from among those menus of adaptation options. And we piloted this for native trout, native cold water fish species that we expect to have a lot of vulnerabilities to climate change. And we focused this on trout in the Northern Rockies, but I think you'll see that a lot of the concepts probably apply to cold water fish in other places, and possibly even including your landscape. I don't have time to go into detail about all of the steps of the framework, but it is a 3-step decision framework. I'll talk real briefly about each one. And again, you can, through that website, you can access the full report and read more details if you're interested. It's possible that, I can't remember, John, if you ended up sending it out to participants ahead of time, but I'd be happy to share it with folks if they're interested, or you can download it for yourself. The first step is about assessing the vulnerability of a particular native trout population or a subset, maybe a sub-watershed of your landscape, and assessing the vulnerability of that population or place to climate change. For native trout, we chose to focus on 3 main vulnerability factors: habitat suitability, so as stream temperatures warm, as flows decrease, and other kinds of changes in the hydrograph impact habitat suitability. Climate change can also influence threats from non-native fish. It can also affect the degree of connectivity between subpopulations, and often can lead to isolation or fragmentation of those populations. So these were the factors that we chose to focus on based on conversations with experts in the region and a review of the literature. And you can see that as your sort of, your vulnerability to climate change increases, as your habitat becomes less suitable, as threats from non-native fish increase, and as your population is more and more likely to either remain or become isolated due to climate change. And so some populations may be affected by one of these 3 climate vulnerability factors. Some populations may be affected by all of them. Obviously, the more factors that you're influenced by, the greater the degree of the vulnerability to climate change, your higher overall vulnerability. And I won't go into great detail about this part, but if you think about an individual population, as you assess it, you might assign it a low habitat suitability score, a high threat from non-native score, and a high likelihood of isolation score. And so you can imagine that there'd be different combinations of these factors and levels of vulnerability for any given population. That turns out in this case there's 12 different combinations of vulnerability factors and levels. And for each of those 12 combinations, we then, again, through discussions with experts and review of the literature, looked at, for those combinations of vulnerabilities and levels of vulnerabilities, how might native fish managers think about their goals and their actions. And so in step two is designed to help to link that vulnerability information to a sense of clarity on what are potentially relevant management goals and specific climate adaptation strategies. So selecting from among that long menu of strategies, which ones may be most appropriate given the assessment of vulnerability. And so to kind of boil it down in a nutshell, we found, our framework posits that as climate change vulnerability increases, as you're more and more vulnerable to more and more of those vulnerability factors, that the value of that place or that population for long-term native trout, cold water trout conservation decreases. As your vulnerability goes up, the potential for keeping those streams as cold water trout streams goes down. And so as we think about our goals along that continuum, if we have low climate change vulnerability, we have a higher chance of being able to maintain native trout. And so your goal may be more likely about maintaining or restoring, in cases where the landscape has been degraded, those strongholds or those longer-term refugia. Whereas if you're at the other end of the spectrum for a given population or place, and your climate change vulnerability is high, and you may have a very difficult time maintaining native trout in that stream, then we may need to think more about actively or passively allowing or facilitating transitions. And maybe we need to think about maintaining that area as a sport fishery, even if it's not a native fishery. And then somewhere in the middle, we may actually be able to play a role in actually trying to ameliorate some of those climate change effects through targeted intervention. With trout, that can look like shading streams so that you reduce the stream temperature warming, or thinking about some of the hydrological benefits that you can or hydrological interventions that can help to keep streams colder for longer. So again, as you look at the combination of the overall level of climate change vulnerability, the sources, so the factors, are you vulnerable to invasion? Are you vulnerable to changes in habitat suitability, or both, can lead you to a subset of those specific climate adaptation strategies from your menu. So again, this assessment of vulnerability not only helps you think about your goals, but also points towards the specific strategies that may be most relevant in that place to achieve that goal in the face of those climate change vulnerabilities. And then step 3 is saying once you've identified a subset of the climate adaptation strategies that are relevant, it points you towards some of specific actions that might be available to implement that strategy. And all the information from this step 3 comes from those exploratory workshops that I mentioned before. So it's pulling together all that information in one place and, again, trying to help connect and say, well, if you have these vulnerabilities, here's, what kind of goals and strategies may be most relevant. And then step 3 is getting towards some specific actions that people have suggested as ways to implement those strategies on the ground. So again, taken together, these 3 steps are designed to use vulnerability information to help you get a better sense of what actions you might take and where you might take those actions, and then being really explicit again about the goal you'd be striving for when you take those actions. And as I mentioned, well, here would be an example. Let's say we have stream temperature modeling information for landscape. In this case, we have really great stream temperature data and modeling future stream temperature data from the Crown of the Continent region in Northern Rockies. This is work done by USGS. And so we can look at a watershed and say, so these are some of the projections of future stream temperatures. So how do we know which actions we should take in each place? Well, by using the framework, we might, it helps us hone in on, well, in those cold water refugia, we may want to focus on protection and really trying to keep those areas in as strong a condition, as good a condition as possible for those native trout, because that may be its stronghold in the future. In some of these middle areas where we see some level of warming, we may be able to take actions to restore hydrology, to restore riparian vegetation, and to try to cool those streams as best as possible. Whereas in some streams where temperatures are projected to move beyond thresholds for native trout, maybe we want to focus on some other species that are valued for other reasons, socioeconomic reasons, or other species that are valued for ecological reasons, even if they're more of a warm water species and not the cold water species that are there today. So while we applied this framework to native trout, we believe it can be useful. The process we used for gathering information and putting together the information in the 3 steps could be valuable for other targets, whether it's other individual species, or maybe an ecosystem type, or even an ecosystem service or ecological function. So we're actively interested in trying to explore whether we can apply this kind of framework to other systems and species, which is one of the many reasons why I'm very excited to be able to share the ideas with you all in case it seems like a useful kind of framework for the work that you will be doing. So let's see. This is where I was going to transition to the next part of my presentation, where I share some real-world examples of people taking climate-informed actions on the ground. But I thought that maybe I would pause here, in part because I've been talking for a very long time, and it's difficult to be interactive when you're speaking to a group remotely. But I thought maybe I would pause here just to see if anybody had any questions about the material I've covered so far, and then, try to reserve a couple of minutes at the end to share some of those examples. But I do want to make sure there's enough time for question and answer related to the material I've presented so far. So if you guys think it would work out okay, we could maybe just pause and do a little bit of question and answer, and you could let me know when there's maybe 5 or 10 minutes left total for this section of the agenda, and I could share some of those examples to finish up.
Molly, this is John Rice. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. Modern technology seems to be working better today than I think I've ever experienced it before, so we're doing very well here. I'm going to try to facilitate the question and answer period here. I've got a microphone so that I can get it to the folks that are located a little farther away from the microphone, and you are actually being magnified through so that we can hear you. Anyone in the audience here has some questions? We have a question.
I'm Duncan Rose, RLSE, outstanding work. I do have a question about the hydrological aspects. Obviously, in trout, there's two major threats from climate change. One is low flow, drying in drought periods, and the other is stream temperature. I'm curious to know how you measured the exposure to low flow and on a systematic mapped basis across all the streams in the study area.
That's a great question, and you'll probably find my answer to be quite a bit of a punt, because I'm not personally involved in doing any of the sort of scientific analyses on impacts and vulnerabilities. In this case of trout, the situation we came into there is that there's, as you probably may be familiar with in the Southern Rockies, quite a lot of scientific research and attention being placed on native trout and cold water fish in general. And so there are lots of research groups that are doing things like what Leslie Jones and Clint Mulfeld are doing up in the crown of the continent, and others are doing on other parts of the landscape where they're trying to map out current and future changes in stream temperatures, trying to map out changes in flow and impacts, trying to define some, temperatures are a lot easier, it sounds like, to sort of articulate particular thresholds where certain exposure to stream temperatures, results in negative impacts on the fish. I imagine stream flows are both a little bit more complex than that, and of course they interact, where lower stream flows are probably going to exacerbate your warming problems. So I don't know a lot of the details on how they are capturing flow exposure to changes in flow. So those would be questions that I would encourage you to, I would direct you towards the fish scientists that are doing that work up in this region, and I'm not directly involved in. I know that there have been some discussion of, in addition to using various kinds of hydrological models, to look at, can you drive those models with future climate variables and look at how it changes runoff. That's one way that people are looking at those stream changes. And again, I don't know what techniques they use to define thresholds of exposure, but I do know that there's a lot of interest out here, and I assume in your landscape as well, in trying to map out where some of those groundwater upwelling sites are, where some colder springs can bring colder water temperatures into stream areas so that they may be relatively more buffered from some of the air temperature warming. And my understanding is that there are some ways of trying to get at that question, but it is a pretty tricky one when you don't have really detailed stream level data to identify those cold upwelling areas. But I think that those are some of the more cutting edge examples of trying to identify some of those refugia, would be looking at where we have groundwater inputs. So I apologize, I can't answer in a lot more detail than that about the science side. What I've been more focused on is saying, once you've got that, once somebody hands you that map of impacts or vulnerabilities, where do you go, where does your thinking go from there? That's the part I've been more focused on.
Do you have a follow-up? All right. Anybody else have a question?
And if there aren't any other questions, I can continue through my slides, and we can, again, see if there's some questions at the very end.
All right. I see no further questions, so why don't we go ahead and proceed?
Okay. So let's see here. What I wanted to end with are just some examples. Again, so even the decision support framework I just showed you is still a decision support tool. It is one that we developed. I didn't necessarily point this out, but we developed it in close partnership with Forest Service managers on the Custer Gallatin National Forest Their office is here in Bozeman, Montana, which is where I'm based, and covers a portion of southwest Montana. And so we worked quite closely with them in developing this tool, and they talked a lot about their interest in using it in, you know, in their decision-making conversations where they're pulling together their various disciplinary teams to make decisions on particular projects or to design projects. But it's still a relatively new tool that we've put out there. So I don't necessarily know of any examples where people have used this tool to make a decision and are implementing actions on the ground. I hope that it will move in that direction, but it's still pretty early on in our delivery of the tool and sharing it with people. But I do want to show some examples just to kind of keep the conversation moving towards action on the ground. Some examples of projects that are out there on the ground implementing actions that stem from targeted thinking on climate change. And these examples all come from a program that I have the real pleasure of being involved in. WCS, my organization, runs a READ-grant program. So we get funding from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. We've been getting $2 million a year that we then re-grant out to conservation organizations, many of whom are working in partnership with public agencies on public lands, to implement actions that are designed to help wildlife and ecosystems respond to and cope with the effects of climate change. So we've given out over $12 million since 2011 in the last 6 years to over 65 projects across the United States. And so I wanted to just share a couple of examples from this portfolio of funded projects, and including at least one project that WCS is directly working on as well, that I think has some relevance for your landscape, although with the caveat being that I, of course, am not an expert in your landscape and in the ecosystems there. So just some food for thought that, again, may be relevant as you think about ideas for addressing climate change and other stressors on the landscapes and ecosystems that you'll be focused on in your workshop this week. Oh, sorry, just real quickly, I'll share a few examples if you want to read more about some of the projects that we're funding. We recently, just very recently, released this report, 14 Solutions to Problems that Climate Change Poses for Conservation, and it is split out, it is sort of structured according to these different common problems that a lot of us are facing: less water, worse droughts, bigger floods, bigger and hotter fires, rising sea levels, which I'm guessing is not quite as relevant there in the Four Corners region. Direct effects on species, so that's looking at changes in habitat suitability driven by climate change. And then the last category is looking at how human land use and behaviors and management decisions, or human decisions about human responses to climate change are posing threats to wildlife conservation. So I'm not going to share all of these examples. You can read the report if you want to hear more. This is also just still a subset of the 66 projects that we've funded over the years. We're continuing to try to find more and more ways to share these stories. But just a couple, you know, less water versus drought, probably already an issue you guys think about a lot in the Four Corners region, and something that could get worse as climate changes. One of the strategies to deal with that is especially as we lose our mountain snowpacks, which for many of our landscapes, certainly up north here, is one of the most critical water storage units for our stream systems. As we lose those snowpacks, looking at ways we can restore the natural water storage capacity of watersheds and ecosystems. So maybe trying to proactively head off discussions about more high elevation reservoirs and dams, thinking about whether we can boost shallow aquifer storage in wetlands and riparian and floodplain areas through the reintroduction of beaver is one strategy for boosting that natural storage in places where beaver may have been extirpated in the past or at least reduced. My colleagues have been working a lot with beaver mimicry techniques. So in places where you can see on this stream that if you put a beaver there, it wouldn't survive. It wouldn't be able to reproduce and feed itself and establish a home there because they're so degraded. So in places that are so degraded that beaver could not be reintroduced, or where conflict is such that beaver reintroduction is not a possibility, we may be able to use beaver mimicry, where we go out and build these structures ourselves and try to restore the hydrology of these stream systems, store more water in the local water table, recreate some of those meanders, slow the flow down so it deposits sediments and rebuilds deeply channelized stream channels, and try to restore the system and create healthy functioning floodplains such that at least some water can be stored in those areas and available for stream systems later in the summer, especially as we lose our mountain snowpacks. Another big challenge is bigger floods. Even in those places where we expect drought to worsen, we also will see times of floods, and sometimes larger floods than what we've been used to experiencing in the past. And so this is an example of a project led by the Nature Conservancy in New York, but again, probably very relevant to our landscapes, where they're redesigning the stream crossings so that they can accommodate bigger floods and don't have, and then continue, so the stream functions can continue, the streams can continue to function hydrologically and ecologically even as we have bigger floods. These structures are also, in the case of this project, being strategically placed in areas where they create connectivity up into colder streams to create that refugia for colder fish species. So these are important actions to take, but they're also being strategic about where they take those actions in places where they're more likely to connect to some of those cold water refugia. Bigger and hotter fires, again, I'm sure a very familiar issue to you in the Four Corners region. This is a project led by the Sky Island Alliance in Arizona, where they are placing these erosion control structures, structures that can be built relatively inexpensively and certainly requires labor, but not necessarily major sort of technological inputs. And they're strategically placing these in areas that either have recently burned or are very likely have a high risk of burning in the near future, with the idea being that after a fire, when we have some of those heavy rain events that are also becoming more common, rather than the soils being eroded off the hillsides, these structures can capture some of that sediment and reduce some of those negative erosion effects. Again, these could be placed very strategically in places where some of the spatial analyses suggest fire risk is highest. And then the last example I'll share, this comes from Minnesota, and I'm not sure, again, exactly what role this would play, this kind of action could play in your landscape, but the concept may be something to consider. Here in these areas, these are actively managed forests, so they are harvesting trees from these forests, and they're actively replanting them after a harvest. And that's to bring back the important forest habitat that's provided for birds and small mammals. And so in the past, the Nature Conservancy and their partners used to, after a harvest, plant those tree species that have long dominated these Northwoods forests, often very boreal or cold-loving species, tree species. But now that they're thinking ahead to climate change, they're looking at which of the tree species are projected to do relatively better and relatively worse under future climate conditions. And they're beginning to bring more of those species that are expected to thrive under future climate conditions into their post-harvest planting mix. And so they are species that are native to the area. They're currently found in these forests, but they have been relatively rare and certainly not dominant and not been the primary focus of planting. And so it's not necessarily bringing species from really far away, but trying to give some boost to the system's ability to shift its composition in a direction that will allow those forests to continue to thrive even as climate changes. And there are a number of examples within our portfolio of funded projects where people are changing up their planting mix for restoration work and thinking more and more about those species that are expected to do better in the future, bringing in seed sources from a little bit lower in elevation, a little bit further south, trying to, again, boost the ability of these systems to continue to function as climate changes. So again, just a little bit of food for thought as you consider ideas that would be, of course, relevant to the issues that you're facing in your landscape and in the species and systems that you'll be focused on. So again, just a couple of really quick closing points that, the importance of vulnerability assessments as a critical input to these conversations that are forward-looking to what the landscape might look like in the future and what actions may be necessary today so that systems can thrive in the future. There are many different stepwise adaptation planning processes and decision support frameworks out there. As you guys move forward, I'm happy to continue to give some advice on what kinds of approaches may be very relevant or applicable to the situation you guys find yourselves in and what you want to try to accomplish. But my main message there is the importance of just getting started and working with colleagues and partners and whatever planning processes that they use. These kinds of, this kind of climate information, this vulnerability assessment information can be incorporated into many of those planning approaches. And so the most important thing is to really get started and keep moving forward the conversation to thinking about your goals and your actions and not worrying too much about the exact technique for doing so. And then lastly, I am inspired by the growing numbers of conservation practitioners that are thinking about climate change, bringing that information into their work. And so I'm excited to be able to share some of those stories and hopefully provide some inspiration for others that are dealing with these same problems. But I think it's also really important that while you may take inspiration from those ideas, it is, of course, necessary to tailor them and make sure you're really addressing the problems that are most important in your landscape, in your ecosystems, and that are going to be locally relevant. And so that was the extent of what I had to present. So I, again, welcome any kind of questions if anybody has any. Otherwise, I know you guys have a lot of important work to get on down to in the rest of today.
Well, thank you, Molly, for your presentation. I don't know if you could hear all of what I just said, but it might just kicked in. But anyway, yeah. We have a first question from Kevin Johnson here, who just couldn't wait for me to even stand up before he wanted to talk to you about this.
So, Molly, you mentioned that WCS, through some other charitable foundations, are funding conservation actions on the ground. And how, so if down here, let's say in this geography that we're working, or that these folks are working on, would they have a greater chance of competing for those conservation dollars if they brought to you science behind their decision as to why they're wanting to spend money in a certain location and science behind what they're doing? Would they have a greater chance of competing for those funds?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I didn't make this point explicit, and I'm glad you asked this question, Kevin, because I wanted to make this point explicit, that I see, hopefully, you all can look to our grant program as sort of a carrot, an incentive for going through the process you're going through. I know that there is not a lot of funding that is explicitly targeted at funding climate change-informed actions. There, of course, may be somewhat less of it coming from the federal government now than there has been in the past, but our program, we give out grants. The maximum amount is $250,000, can cover a 1 to 2 year project. And we, again, will be giving out, actually this year, we'll be giving out $2.5 million. Next year, we'll be giving out another $2.5 million. And we absolutely are looking for projects that are doing the on-the-ground implementation, but that can talk about and link the justification for those actions, the where they're taking them and what they're doing, back to the best available climate science and planning work that they've done. So a project that is able to look at information like what the vulnerability assessments and analyses, the spatial analyses that you guys will be refining this week, being able to use that information to talk about why you're working, where you're working, and what actions you're taking is definitely the kind of project that we're looking to support. It's that strong scientific basis is a necessary component to getting funding from our program. You know, there's also, it's a competitive RFP, so there are always more projects that apply than we can fund. So just having that alone isn't necessarily the only factor involved in our decisions, but it is definitely a necessary component to applying to our grant program. Because I know that there are probably a lot of agencies there in the room, I also want to make sure it's clear that our grant program, to apply, to be eligible to apply, you need to be a 401c3 nonprofit organization. But we are very excited to see public-private partnerships. We have many, many projects that are being implemented on state and federal public lands. Some of them are implemented on private lands, but with agencies as a partner, and funding can pass through to those agencies, even though they can't be a primary applicant.
Thanks, Molly. Are there any other questions? Well, I'm told you should count at least 7 before you start talking again, and I did that this time. But I see that we have no further questions, and Molly, we want to thank you for your presentation. It was very helpful in helping us understand where we need to be looking toward next as we go through the vulnerability assessment today.
Yeah, well, great. Well, like I said, I wish that I could be there with you guys because I'm very interested to see, to learn from the discussions that you all have. These are all really active learning opportunities. Like I was saying at the very beginning, there's no right or wrong way to do these things. My main encouragement is encouraging people to, be very clear about the scientific information that they're using when they think about their decisions, to kind of document your thinking on how that information plays into the design of priorities and strategies and project actions on the ground. And so I look forward to hearing how the rest of the meeting goes and seeing some of the products you release. And like I said, I'd be happy to be a sounding board as you guys move forward. You know, definitely just as one quick last point on the grant program, you know, you guys may be able to utilize some of this information to gear up towards some proposal ideas for our next call for proposals, which usually comes out in the early part of the calendar year, usually in February. We have a pre-proposal process, so, you know, I'd be happy to continue to stay in touch with you guys and give feedback along the way of ideas that could be a good fit for that program.